Hello, good evening. I'm Ariola Pira. I'm the curator here at the VLC Center for Art and Politics, and it's my pleasure to welcome you this evening here at the New School. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that we are gathered on unceded land of the Lenape people, among other indigenous peoples. I ask you to join me in acknowledging the Lenape community, their elders, both past and present, as well as future generations. The New School and the VLC Center acknowledge that they were founded upon exclusion and erasures of many indigenous peoples, including those on whose land we are gathered here tonight. This acknowledgement demonstrates a commitment to beginning the process of working to dismantle the ongoing legacies of settler colonialism. We gather this evening to consider archives in general and queer approaches in specific, as prompted by Dean Erdmann's exhibition, And Apollo, a Laboratory. Dean's exhibition is a 2018-2020 VLC Center Fellowship project and was organized by myself and Christiane, Director and Chief Curator at the Sheila C. Johnson Design Center. I hope you've all had a chance to see the show on your way in, and if not, the exhibition is on view through February 11th. An alternate topic for tonight's program was illiberalism, an underlying concern of Dean's project, which connects our historical pasts that have produced current moments of social and political crisis. Confronted as we are with a rising tide of liberalism sweeping the globe, through our 2-year investigation of our theme, If Art is Politics, we've posited art as a political practice to counter such developments. Dean and the artists joining us this evening work with queer archives, personal or institution, and on occasion, their absence. It seemed to us that this offers more by way of pointing to a queer life that took place outside of institutions, outside of institutionalized forms of history making. They offer queer interventions in the ways in which we can think about the making and reshifting of narratives, especially as they intersect with the histories of gender, sex, race, and colonialism. Well, illiberalism at large. Thank you all for accepting our invitation. It is my pleasure to introduce Christiane, my fellow co-organizer of Dean's exhibition, as this evening's moderator. Christiane will briefly introduce each speaker, but there is also extended bios in the program, and on the back of those programs is a full list of our upcoming programs for this semester. Thank you for joining us.
Good evening, and thanks again for coming out tonight. Thanks to the VLC Center for organizing and to the presenters for participating. As Ariola already explained, our panel tonight will explore institutional versus personal archives with a focus on queer approaches to archives. All of the participants in this panel have been either involved in the creation of archives or worked with archival materials. We will explore in our discussion later on stakeholders in and frameworks for archives, issues of inclusion and exclusion, and notions of queering the archive. So as to the format, each presenter will give a brief talk and then we'll reconvene and have a discussion amongst each other and with you. And without further ado, I would actually like to introduce our first presenter. I'm going to do just very brief introductions for everyone. So Shannon Marin is a professor of anthropology at the New School for Social Research. Her writing and teaching focus on archives, libraries, and other media spaces, on media infrastructures, and spatial epistemologies. She is the author of a few books, all published by University of Minnesota Press: The New Downtown Library, Designing with Communities, Deep Mapping the Media City, and Code and Clay, Data and Dirt, 5,000 Years of Urban Media. She also contributes a regular long-form column about urban data and mediated infrastructures to Places, which is a journal focusing on architecture, urbanism, and landscape. So, Shannon, please join us on stage. Thank you.
Okay, so Thank you, everybody, for coming this evening. Thanks very much for the invitation. So it's a bit of a joke among information professionals that folks in the academy and art world often organize panels about archives without including any practicing archivists. In an influential 2016 article, "The Archive is Not an Archives," archivist Michelle Caswell contrasted humanities, scholars, and artists' long-standing fascination with the archive, which they regard as an epistemological utopia or dystopia theorized by the likes of Foucault and Derrida, with actual archivists' understandings of them. Quote, "For archival studies scholars and practicing archivists," she writes, "archives' emphasis on the S are collections of records, material and immaterial, analog and digital, the institutions that steward them, the places where they're physically located, and the processes that designated them archival," end quote. Few of those humanities scholars and archivists she charges acknowledge the intellectual contributions of actual archivists or the scholarship in archival studies. For those reasons, I want to make sure we engage with the scholarly work and professional practices of practicing archivists as we discuss the archive and what makes it queer here this evening. To better appreciate the queerness of my interlocutor's practice, it's probably a good idea to look at some of Western archivy's foundational, very non-queer principles, which can be traced back to the 1898 Manual for Arrangement and Description of Archives and the 1922 Manual for Archive Administration. These guides emphasize the principles of original order, which posits that records should be maintained in the same order in which they are arranged by their creator, and respect des fonds, which is the principle of grouping records by provenance, by the administration, organization, family, individual, or creating body in which they originated. In other words, the records of one corporation or artist shouldn't be mixed with those of others. Either earlier approaches involved organizing records by subject, function, legal, utility, chronology, etc. But by maintaining institutional integrity and original order, the logic goes, we can learn a lot about the archival entity. We can learn just as much from its file structure as we can from what's in those files. To take a classically queer analogy, imagine walking into someone's closet. You could begin psychoanalyzing them by looking at how the shoes and sweaters, memorabilia, and dead media are categorized and arranged, before you even begin looking at individual garments. This would be a lot harder to do if that person shared the closet with their roommate. Yet many archival theorists acknowledge that provenance, or respect des fonds, and original order are leaky and highly contestable covenants. Fonds themselves can contain multiple modes of classification. A collection's original order may have been compromised over time. The rise of digital technology has compromised the stability of the archival record, which has historically been regarded as evidence that takes on a persistent form that is fixed in a particular medium. Digital media have also necessitated new means of conceptualizing what even order means. As archivist and anthropologist Jarrett Drake has powerfully explained, quote, "Provenance emerged as a concept in the West at the same time most people were structurally, if not legally, excluded from ownership of their bodies, minds, labor, property, and records. Its application in archives reflects the limitation of state regimes in the West to fully recognize the human rights of indigenous Americans, Black people, women, and gender nonconforming people," end quote. If we look to the finding aid, the primary tool of archival description and discovery, we find evidence of provenance's colonialist and patriarchal history. The biographical note we typically find right at the top features, quote, "massive memorials and monuments to wealthy, white, cisgendered, and heterosexual men," end quote. These are the fatherly fonds, the institutional order of privileges. And all these principles inform archival appraisal, the process by which archivists determine which materials should be accessioned and how long they should be maintained. According to the Society of American Archivists, appraisal decisions are based on provenance, content, authenticity and reliability, order and completeness, records condition and the cost to preserve them, and their quote-unquote intrinsic value. Those considerations of value, Drake reminds us, are conditioned by the much larger historical cultural ideologies, which determine whose bodies and stories matter. And this is why, as much as I'm sympathetic to archivists pleased that scholars and artists recognize their intellectual contributions and professional work, and while I recognize the critically important work that many activist archivists are doing to address these institutional injustices, to decolonize the archive, to facilitate personal digital archiving and support community archives, I also think it's imperative to acknowledge the archival work taking place outside orthodox institutions, work that's ignorant of or knowingly contrary to best practices. In Kate McKinney's forthcoming Information Activism, a lesbian feminist history of media technologies, which I had the pleasure of reviewing, she examines the historical projects, including the Lesbian Switchboard, the Lesbian Herstory Archives, which some of you probably know about, and the Circle of Lesbian Indexers. She argues that these communities regarded information management and archive building as central to the creation of feminist, anti-racist, trans-inclusive social movements. McKinney describes how populations with precarious access to control over information respond by resourcefully appropriating common communications and archiving tools, putting them into practice cultural techniques that reshape standards in information management. In the collaborative work of building archive-centered movements, these various activist groups demonstrate the lie of many archival ideals and professional standards, and thus the need to queer those conventions. The artists and archivists we'll hear from this evening will be examining the collaborative and individual creation of archives not only for queer collectives, but also for individuals, families, and institutions. As a preview to their work, I'll share the work of an artist archivist that I wrote about in a recent article about fugitive libraries. Many of the Black feminist artists and librarians I featured in this piece didn't really adhere much to institutional boundaries, including the distinction between the archive, which is typically meant to hold primary documents, and libraries, which typically hold published materials that can be accessed much more freely. Their work transgresses proper institutional architectures and exists outside bureaucratic structures that weren't made for it. So in these last couple minutes, in my final 2 minutes, I'll draw from that article. Alexis Pauline Gumbs, alongside her partner Sangudaire, has built a lending and reference library of Black feminist texts in her home. Invoking the history of maroon communities and fugitive slaves, Gumbs said she aims to show that Black people, quote, do not need to wait for or pander or to foundation funding or a corporately validated organizational structure to create what we need, end quote. The state, and particularly the current federal government, isn't necessarily accountable to Black people or to feminists or to LGBTQI folks, she says, and thus autonomy is important to us. She was inspired by women like Barbara Smith of the Black feminist lesbian Combahee River Collective, who helped start a radical publishing house, Kitchen Table, Women of Color Press. Black women know that their resources and selfhood are not necessarily marketable, she told me. And so we have to cherish and nurture a mission that says, in the words of the River Collective, that we are inherently valuable. This goes back to that question of inherent value that was one of the determinations of whether you even access a collection. So the living room library forms the intellectual core of the eternal summer of the Black feminist mind, which Gumbs describes as a multifaceted educational project, a tiny Black feminist university with infinite schools, the School of Our Lord, honoring our dear Lord, the Juneteenth Freedom Academy, after June Jordan, for instance. And they've also taken their work on the road as the Mobile Homecoming, an intergenerational experiential archive, for which they traveled across the United States in a 1988 Winnebago named Sojourner the RV, that stands for Revolutionary Vehicle, while interviewing, honoring, and hosting intergenerational retreats for and as Black LGBTQ feminists. Through such travels, their project opens out from the living room to confront the racialized spatial politics of a larger world. Gumbs says that she and Sangudaire met with elders facing housing insecurity or other transitions. They came to see displacement as the ongoing context of being in community as queer Black feminists who want to change the world and also have to live inside of change. Many people living amidst instability have donated their own book and artifact collections to the Eternal Summer Library, which is physically accessible only to readers who come to Durham, North Carolina. That's a problem, as Gumbs acknowledged in an interview with the local Alt Weekly. Quote, we want to honor the fact that Black feminist brilliance is shared, shareable, and renewable community resource, not private property. We realized that we had to take a big shift and make sure that this collection, which is a community resourced, could also be truly available to the community. Being available for her means being both rooted and mobile. To that end, she has founded the Mobile Homecoming Living Library Archive and Trust, which seeks to buy land and build a physical archival repository, retreat center, and ultimately an all-ages independent and assisted living center, where we can keep being libraries and experiential archives for each other. Between these various projects, Gums and her collaborators are building queer collections and communities in forms both physical and virtual, housed and unhoused, settled and unsettled, rooted and fugitive. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Shannon, and I will actually introduce the next presenter from here while you can already bring up your presentation. So next up will be Dean Erdmann, whose work addresses the politics of place, class, and the body. Often using archives as source materials, Dean uses still and moving images from found and original footage and arranges them into new forms, destabilizing and building anew these very materials. Dean's work has been exhibited at venues including One Archive, Red Hat, and the Hammer Museum in LA, as well as the Museum of Contemporary Art in Kanazawa, Japan. Dean also has 400-foot LA Metro work upcoming, and their work is included in the Mexicali Biennial.
Thanks, Christiane. So I'll begin with some information that's not included in the current chapter of my And Apollo exhibition that's on view around the corner if you haven't seen it. It's open until February 11th. But I'll touch on some stuff that's a part of the broader scope of the project. I started my conversations at the Magnus Hirschfeld Society during a brief visit to Berlin in the summer of 2017. I found them by accident, a small tip from a thoughtful archivist in another archive. Since that visit, I've remained in correspondence with one of their archivists, Raymond. This summer, I spent 5.5 weeks conducting research at the Magnus Hirschfeld Society during their limited open hours. The archive is run by volunteers. I find resonance between the work being done there and the archaeological aspects of my project. Each of our projects began knowing very little, sending out sounds in the dark and waiting for echoes to return. Then began the process of extrapolating ephemeral or affective relations and objects. We also both began with letters. During a trip home to the Mojave Desert for Thanksgiving in 2016, I decided to look at the binder that had been compiled by a relative in the 90s and stored in the silence of a storage chest in my childhood home. The binder contained a family tree and letters, copies of originals, and some copies of translated letters. On my father's side, my recently emigrated German relatives were writing and receiving letters from the family that had remained in Germany, with letters dating from the 1910s to the early 1950s. These letters describe rising costs of goods, the health and death of family members, and occasionally involvement in Nazi-era politics. While I was long aware of my family's German roots, the collection of letters exchanged both pre- and post-war has underscored for me not only the ways in which families can become party to and supportive of racist, fascist, genocidal states, but also how conservative working class cultures have always been global in their networks. The support my family expressed for the Nazi policies was then rescinded in a post-war letter. This inability to face oneself, one's national crimes, or even acknowledge them has resonance within the history of the US too. In each context, both active and passive forms of social consent provide overt and ambient conditions for violence, so specifically in environments of escalating threats, exclusion, and xenophobia. Alongside uncovering this familiar history of hate, I remain committed to the power of minor and reparative histories. The story of the Magnus Hirschfeld Society, a group of gay archivists seeking to rebuild the unrebuildable, is a powerful example of this reparative effort. This part of my research collides two historic realities. The xenophobic beliefs of my family is demonstrated in letters, and my experience in my own genderqueer body. This is an image of the small office of the Magnus Hirschfeld Society in a building west of Motta. The blown-up copy of an image of the Institute for Sexual Research sits on top of a photocopier, a copy on top of a copy maker. The site of the former Institute for Sexual Science is now the site of the Haus der Kulturen. The building was a gift from the United States. The liberation work in Germany during the Weimar period, of which Hirschfeld was a part, predates the US gay and queer liberation movements by several decades. Hirschfeld's Institute for Sexual Science was founded in 1919 as a communal, sexual, political, and emotional space for people of different genders and orientations. In one anecdote, Hirschfeld is reported to have calculated more than 43 million genders, but then speculated that that number must be too few. Against this background, the ISS provided resources for trans folks, hosted cultural events, queer parties, offered sex education across sexualities, gave guidance about birth control, offered therapy, and sought to overturn paragraph 175, Germany's sodomy law. In 1933, the ISS was the target of an early Nazi raid, and the spectacular bonfire of its research, practice, and learning began the horrific destruction of its idealistic commitment to constantly different ways of being. In the wake of this violence, the Magnus Hirschfeld Society now pursues the seemingly impossible task of recuperating the Institute, its history, its memory, its research, and its books. Utopian in vision, in their 30-plus years, the Society has met with limited but powerful success. The Magnus Hirschfeld Society began in 1982 as preparations were being made by the Berlin Senate for the 50th anniversary of the Nazi Party taking power in Germany in 1933. Several groups targeted by the Nazis were excluded from recognition at the event. Exclusion from the official program prompted the soon-to-be archivists to try to gain inclusion. When that didn't work, they started their own program. Seeking a commemorative rallying point from 1933, they remembered the destruction of the Hirschfeld Institute, which, according to Ralph Dosa, one of the founding members of the Magnus Hirschfeld Society, they didn't actually know much about, and they didn't think that much remained to be found. They knew at the very least that it was a place for LGBTQI people to congregate. Ralph describes the beginning of their search, and I quote, "Doctors and scientists, their names are in their papers. They write books, they write articles, so it's easier to find them. If you want to identify someone who never wrote an article, who never wrote a book, who never went to any high school, where do you find those people that just came? We don't have the files of the patients, the card index of the visitors is lost. The younger ones, and not many of them, joined the Scientific Humanitarian Committee. Not many of them had the money to spend on committees and things, and so their names are not listed. How to find them? That's impossible." End quote. The Magnus Hirschfeld Society's findings come from a collage of deep persistence, letters, strangers holding odd objects, luck, and the internet. In Rolf's words, one thing leads to another. One of my favorite anecdotes from my visits was Raymond, the archivist, describing how a man came to the office and dropped off a book, and it was a book of women's clothing, and he said, "I found this book at a flea market, and it has the stamp of the Institute for Sexual Science, and I'm giving you this book because I don't want the Nazis to win." And so I love that a book of women's clothing can be used as an anti-fascist tool, and that a book can be a weapon. Back to my text. While Hirschfeld's an important and interesting cultural figure, I'm most interested in the archivists and their practice of care, not only for Hirschfeld's work, but for those named and nameless among their community, for their practice of retelling the stories contained in and around the archive, and retelling the stories that also rebuild it. My work at the Magnus Hirschfeld Society has led me to recreate, in glass, the 34 books that the archivists have recovered from the original 10,000 volumes, most of which was lost in the 1933 bonfire. I use photogrammetry to reconstruct a 3D model of each book. The 3D model will then be milled and molds made so that it can be cast in glass. Photogrammetry. The use of glass merges presence and absence in content and material, but also the ephemeral nature of affect. Using heat in the process of recreation, I'm transforming the site of erasure. Here I am thinking of books as openings, placeholders, fantasies, books lost and those to be found, new ones to build upon, and the mobility of these objects even in their absence. My research led to a friendship with one of the archivists and an introduction to the writing of Eva Sievert, a close friend of Kurt Hiller, who was a lead figure in the queer German liberation movement. A lesbian and former radio host with writings nearly forgotten, her story became visible in the periphery and not as a central figure at the Institute. The first English translation of her story, Das Oracle, is the subject of a short experimental film in progress as a part of Antropology. I'm working with a young genderqueer person proficient in German to translate Sievert's story. Filmed with my Jewish partner, interweaving text, a tenderly hesitant orator, and a queer visual strategy of discontinuous editing, Das Oracle offers the first translation from German to English of Eva Sievert's short story, portraying a couple, one Jewish, the other half Jewish, navigating German violence and xenophobia during the Nazi period. Rather than explicitly describe lesbian love at the heart of the story, Sievert's text is written from the perspective of an unnamed, non-gendered first-person narrator, and the audience is encouraged to read into this story of refuge, exile, and loss, other strategies of survival. In a process of intergenerational telling, speaking, and listening, we also spoke with the translator's German grandmother and mother to help with the translation. Through anachronistic structuring, this 75-year-old story re-enters the present with contemporary refugee crises, anti-immigrant violence and rhetoric, and both extrajudicial and bureaucratic violence of the state. This work thinks about collecting as a form of renewal, and how when things are collected, they touch and unfold upon each other to build new understandings and new relationships between layers, objects, and histories. Building new relationships, excavating and translating historical materials, entails inheriting new forms of responsibility, open at each turn to reorientation rather than closure or completion. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Dean. Next up will be Carlos Motta. Carlos' multidisciplinary art practice documents the social conditions and political struggles of sexual, gender, and ethnic minority communities in order to challenge dominant and normative discourses through visibility and self-representation. In 2019, Carlos had solo exhibitions at PPOW Gallery here in New York and Galeria Vermelho in Sao Paulo, and participated in group exhibitions at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the ICA in Boston, and SF MoMA. His work was the subject of survey exhibitions at the Museum of Modern Art in Medellin, Colombia, which actually traveled to multiple venues, and Carlos Motta for Democracy, There Must Be Love in Gothenburg, Sweden. His solo exhibitions at international museums include ones at the Stedelijk Museum in Amsterdam, at the Perez Museum in Miami, at Tate Modern and Pinchuk Art Center in Kiev.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you, Christiane and Karen and Dean for creating the platform to have the chance to speak about these things. I'm not going to read, I'm just going to speak about two projects more loosely, trying to make a couple points of my interest in archival practices, in working with institutional archives, and also in creating databases that could be read or understood as queer archives. I'm going to start from the more recent work that I have done, even though the work I'm not showing now is not exactly from the present, but I think it will articulate my interest in these practices. So a few years ago, I started to become really interested in kind of recognizing the violences that have been, to which queer lives have been subjected historically, and the ways that those things exist as absences in institutional archives, in particular colonial archives. So for that, I spent some time working in archives in Spain, in Portugal, in Colombia and Mexico, and in Argentina, looking through the ways in which queer lives had been archived in primarily criminal files in these specific institutions. And in the process of finding those files, in really also there's not like a keyword for like homosexual or homoerotic or sodomite or anything like that, but just really looking through the criminal cases, I started to recognize a pattern where cases of same-sex sexuality, cases of sodomy, experiences of non-conforming gender identities at the time were categorized specifically by the Spanish and Portuguese empires as crimes against nature. And the word that was used to describe this was this word nefandus, which is a Latin word that speaks about something that is so unnameable or so, that is so immoral and despicable that it renounces enunciation. It's something that cannot be named and cannot be spoken about. So, curiously enough, I started to use that word in this institutional archives, and it started to show up a lot. So it made my life easier. I had to find a keyword, that pertained to a system of categorization. So looking at that word, I started to find these really interesting cases where these queer subjects that had defied both moral and legal, which at the time were very much, one, laws were found. And in doing that, I also started to see the ways in which the archive as an institution, as an imperial institution, as a colonial institution, was reproduced into the present, right? There was very little challenging of those historical processes of history to be able to contest them, which led me to, of course, try to find alternative readings of those histories through the social sciences, texts from the 18th century up to the present, always recognizing that violence was reproduced by these colonial frameworks of knowledge. So I've worked on a few projects that use this as a point of departure. One of them I'm going to share now is not exactly looking at these lives of these people who were criminalized in these archives, but actually looking at lives of pre-Hispanic and indigenous cultures from the Americas. And the way that I did that was doing some research on the artifacts and objects that they left behind and that survived the violences and erasures of the conquest. So I obsessively started to find objects that represented homoerotic relations, objects that existed in museum collections of anthropology and archaeology. Spent some time in the Museum of Anthropology in Mexico City, also going through books, always finding that these objects had actually been relegated to never been shown. And when they were discussed in ways that very much resisted the idea of speaking about sexuality, the pleasure, the body, or any of these kind of modern categories that we used to refer to gender and sexual issues in the present. So I built a mini archive of my own, or a collection of these images, and thought that it would be interesting to use these images as a way to build a kind of presentation that would bring together these objects that represented these forms of sexuality. So this is a project that is called Towards Homoerotic Historiography. In fact, this project is now on view at the Met Breuer in Uptown. If anyone wants to see it in person, it's going to be there until the end of June. And what it does is two things. On the one hand, is also looking at the ways in which not only the archive as an institution, but museums as institutions that use forms of display and rely on aesthetic forms of presentation have perpetuated these same narratives around what is good and what is bad, what is evil and what is good, all of those things that I had started to spot in those archives themselves. So the project relies heavily on aesthetics and aesthetics of display and presentation and installation. And the idea was to sort of like mimic the ways in which an encyclopedic museum like the Louvre or the Metropolitan itself, for example, would rely on means of presentation. So backlighting, how do you call this? Light boxes, dark colors, carpet, all of these things. So I decided that I wanted to create a room that would present itself in a very institutional way, in very official terms, and then populated with an experience for the viewer that would be seductive. And upon that seduction, confront them with reproductions of some of these pre-Hispanic objects that depicted these forms of sexuality. So what you see through those little windows is miniature replicas of these objects that I started to find. They're about the size of your thumb, and they are categorized loosely based on the place where they found, the culture that they pertain to. And it is important for me to remark that in creating this form of archive, if you will, or this kind of institutional presentation, the idea was not to say there were also homoerotic encounters or people who lived their experiences of sexuality and gender also in those cultures. That part was less interesting to me. What was interesting to me was to think about how the very categories of sexuality and gender are in and of themselves in a contemporary sense and through the experience of those of colonialism and coloniality, colonial categories in themselves, and how the language that we use to describe them, how we engage them, how we see them, pertains to a legacy of colonialism that we cannot escape. Precisely, and especially through, if we also think of critical theoretical models, including queer theory, that pertain to a legacy of Western, European and American-based forms of enunciation. So the second approach I've done to these stories is actually working with the legal cases themselves. So for example, the image that you have in the screen is the case of a woman who was labeled a hermaphrodite at the beginning of the 18th century in Colombia. And this is that you see in this document that she has been labeled a hermaphrodite whose sexual parts are larger than they should be. The story is complicated, and maybe I don't have time to explain it now, but my idea has been to recognize the forms in which these characters have been turned into examples in history, right? The way that we engage their existence is only because of their queerness, and I'm using here queer in the original sense of the word because of their rarity as opposed to their special differences, if you will, and work through them to take them out of that negative connotation of their lives as being exemplary of a transgression. So I have worked collaboratively with several people creating scripts for films. This is actually a film called Deseos, which tells the story of this person, recognizing that her name was Martina Parra. Martina's life was conditioned by her tragedy, right? And the only way that she exists in our memory is because she survived in this very heteropatriarchal imperial archive as an example of something that shouldn't have been. And the idea with these films has been to think about how we can perhaps, in what maybe Saidiya Hartman terms critical fabulation, engage with the archive in a way in which we can provide a sense of subjectivity and self to someone who has been lost to these violences of the institutional archive in itself. Did I already pass my time?
No, you haven't.
Okay, all right. On a different angle, I've also been interested in looking at the LGBTQI plus politics of the present and thinking about how did we get here? How did we go from a movement that started as a form of revolt and liberation, resistance to imperialism, the machinery of war, capitalism, etc. in the late 60s and 70s to a movement of assimilation that treasures equality as the most precious thing, with the icing on the cake being gay marriage. So what was that process like? How did we turn into this kind of machine of inclusion and assimilation? So to that, I wanted to talk to people who have lived through these decades and have been engaged and were engaged in constructing queer attempts at finding rights, right? So this is a project I did in 2012 as a commission of Unjiju at the New Museum, and it is composed of two parts. There is an installation component to it, there is a publication and a series of objects, and it is also on an online database. And the material I used was close to 60 interviews that I developed with activists, academics, artists, doctors, nurses, etc. in 4 countries, in Norway, in the United States, in Colombia, and in South Korea. And my idea was to present to these people based on the work of a writer, a Norwegian writer from the 1950s that was that posed this idea of feeling differently, to recuperate the question of difference in a culture that has constructed the idea of equality as what we should be aiming for. So the conversations are looking at the ways in which these activists think about these processes that change that question of difference and rarefied it even more to end up in a culture of assimilation. The installation is also conceived as a place for activating some of these issues on a local scale. So I'm interested in when I do these kinds of presentations, have a connection to the place. And I don't know if someone here was a part of this, but we had, back in 2012, but we had a 3-month period of Thursday night events where people were invited to engage with the themes that were presented by the materials in the videos or the book, but also bring other topics that were critical to that time. So for example, in the lower right is Ryan Conrad, one of the co-founders of the publishing collective Against Equality, who's addressing the question of don't ask, don't tell at the moment, and kind of like critically engaging with the history of resistance to war and what it meant for queer bodies to want to be included in that machinery as opposed to use that very same critical difference of queerness to resist the machinery of war. And the other part is the online database, which we were talking with Christiane, because this is already old, is becoming anachronistic and it will need to be saved from the advances of technology. But for now, it's still there, and it is the archive of the full interviews, which are about 60 to 70 minutes, which the people that I interviewed. What you see here is just a screenshot of the people I talked to in the United States. But you can also browse it thematically in terms of demographics, in terms of keywords, etc. I had other things, but I think I will leave it there. Thank you so much.
And our last presenter is Tiona Nekkia McClodden, who is a visual artist, filmmaker, and curator whose work explores and critiques issues at the intersections of race, gender, sexuality, and social commentary. Tiona's interdisciplinary approach traverses documentary film, experimental video, sculpture, and sound installations. She has exhibited and screened work at the ICA in Philadelphia, at MoMA, at the Whitney Museum, MoCA LA, Raumerweiterungshalle Berlin, MoMA PS1, and many other institutions. And she recently was awarded the 2019 Buxbaum Award, chosen from among the 75 artists whose works were presented in the 2019 Whitney Biennial.
Hello. I'm excited to be here. It's like my first presentation of the year, so it's a nice fog because I did so much last year. So I'm going to talk about 3 projects in 10 minutes. So I have a lot of things for you to look at, and I'm going to try to pace myself through it. The intersections of the projects that I'm going to present on involve the ways that I relate to the archive or investigate the archive or engage with it. For a period of 4 years of my life, from 2015 up until 2019, pretty much before that. I did a body of work that I call a triptych. It's like a body of work for 3 different men who produce work at the height of the AIDS epidemic. So the men that I'm going to be talking about are Essex Hemphill, Julius Eastman, and Brad Johnson. So I always start off with this because I like to, you already heard a little bit of the bio, but I do the artist statement because it's always in reconsideration. I'll probably edit it after I get out of here. So as a filmmaker, video artist, nonlinear narrative, rememory, and more recently biomythography are themes explored within my work. My work explores shared ideas, values, and beliefs within the African diaspora, or what I call Black Mentifact. I'm interested in Blackness and traversing nostalgia, and how the past, present, and future can intersect visually and thematically within time-based work. I'm invested in exploring intersubjectivities within Black communities as a tool for creating insider perspectives within film, time-based works, and objects. Essex Hemphill, born 1957, dies 1995, Philadelphia, PA. So Essex Hemphill is someone who came to me in college during the 2 years that I was in college before I dropped out, while I was at Clark Atlanta in Atlanta, and came to me through this text, In the Life, that was written by Joseph Beam and put out in 1986. And so the poems kind of gave me a foundational idea, especially the anthology form, kind of informed the way that I then moved into a documentary film practice, like the need to put a grouping of people together to kind of disrupt the monolith of what people think of these particular isolated ideas of sexuality, gender presentation, et cetera. Stephen, hello. Stephen Fullwood publishes a text called Black Gay Genius in 2013, answering Joseph Beam's call. I use this as a reference because I'm interested in people who take the form of maybe influence and then do an update or representation. It's something that I look at even in this book form. It's something that informs the way that I think about how I approach my films. And Stephen Fullwood is someone that I have to acknowledge. He was going to be in this whether he was in the front row or not. Someone who is very important to a lot of us who do research on Black LGBT queer folks, as the founder of the In the Life archive at Schomburg, where he worked for many, many years, is now an independent archivist. So in 2015, to give you an idea how Essex comes into my life, where I'm able to do something for him, the ICA in Philadelphia asked me to do this commission project where I would take over their website on World AIDS Day with a project. So I decided to think about Essex Hemphill's work. The reason I decided to think about his work is because about a year before, I had a panel presentation and a young man had come up to me and asked me for a text to read, and I mentioned Essex Hemphill's ceremonies. And he Googled it on his phone right there. He's like, oh, I can't afford it. It's $200. And I was just like, okay. Also, there's two things happening. It's just, it's not like, I'm 38. This person is maybe at the time 25. It's not a very young, situation. So I was kind of blown away by that, but also very aware that there was something going on in regards to the conversation around publication or publishing. Ceremonies is out of print. And it does yield, still to this day, even after the project I'm going to show you, between $100 to $700, because what's being sold are dead stock copies. Ceremonies is published in 1992. Brother to Brother is a text that Essex completes before he puts out his own work for Joseph Beam, after being brought into Joseph Beam's archive after he passes by Joseph Beam's mother. It's important to note. The project that I create lives on my website. I decided to, based off of that moment, that interaction, this Googling moment, to create something that would exist online. What I did is I sourced all my material online, looking up everything that I could find on Essex Hemphill. Then from there, I went and visited all the people who survived him, who would speak to me, and created a movement in the fourth part of the process, where it's an audio engagement where I'm wearing in-ear mics. So it kind of sounds like you're in my head, you're sitting in that space. And they talk about Essex. Everything is handwritten by me to kind of keep a hold of his intellectual property, so it can't be copied and pasted. Through this, the challenge here is that Essex Hemphill does not have what we call a formal archive of his own. He exists through other people's donations and archives of that nature as a tag, or the materials that they have of his. What I wanted to do was go and see and ask the people what they had of his left. And so what I was able to do is put my hand on text that I only heard of. And from there, I created excerpts from everything that I read that you could see on that piece. So in an investigation further, looking at some more materials, I was looking at Blackout. Blackout, this issue is 1986. And in this, Joseph Beam is the editor, and, guest editor for it. And there's a figure named Brad Johnson who writes this long extended review for Essex Hemphill, Earth Life, his earlier book that precedes that. It's like a chat book, CHAT, chat book. And so I'm interested in that, you know, just in terms of like him having a review, basic. Brad Johnson, born 1952, dies in 2011, Philadelphia, PA. I come across a text called Other Countries, something that I heard of, and the bookseller sells it to me for its original price. It was about $7. This is published in 1988. In there, I come across a text after like, you know, a couple of weeks carrying it around because my initial interest in the book or the text or the journal or anthology of sorts was a Bayard Rustin interview where he kind of like tells everything. So it's kind of like a gossip thing. But I was blown away. I remember riding on the train in Philly of this text on subjugation. I was like, who wrote this? How the fuck did they write this? I want to know who this person is. Google them, nothing. Eventually I keep Googling, and then there's Stephen Fullwood, who has a feature online for like a blog for the Schomburg at the time that says Brad Johnson's archive is here, basically saying he wishes somebody would come visit him. So I come visit him. From there, I look at a very small archive, 6 boxes, and a container of books and publications. I realize he's quite prolific, but the issue here is that all of the books that were published were the people who published them also died of AIDS complications, so all of their rights are out of print. So what I'm going to jump through is kind of show you the explosion that happens from that engagement. I take that text on a residency and create a series of self-portraits called Se Te Subió El Santo in 2016. Brad Johnson does an amazing job, I think, at dealing and giving language to cruising, as well as BDSM, kind of like ideas around the interiority of BDSM. So I take pictures of myself with my body, my queer body, kind of disclosing my relationship to the BDSM community. I create a tape called the Brad Johnson tape, where I read 10 documents, 8 that are sealed, meaning that they've never been published, while also engaging in SM acts on myself. The last one is me suspended by my feet, reading on subjugation. That ends up going into an exhibition called Speech Acts, where the curator takes my entire studio and puts it in the museum, where I create a conversation of material culture, thinking about the things that Brad has written about, pictures that I've seen that no longer exist. I read the books that he reads, so those become like ephemeral texts that are scattered around. And I'm able to put him back in this conversation with Essex Hemphill through the placement of a video that opens the Essex Hemphill project that also then counters his piece. I continue that work with The Labyrinth, another text, create a short film also with objects, that it results into an archival investigation or smashing of queer porn, both surveillance and also performative, as well as thinking about how to put the archive as well as ideas around cruising and structuralism back into the Black body. Julius Eastman, 1940, dies 1990 in Buffalo, New York. Julius Eastman is an avant-garde Black gay composer, pianist, dancer, poet, painter, etc. I'm interested in him because when he comes up, all those things are mentioned in regards to his legacy. I do not know who he is. So these are 2 excerpts of pieces that really took hold of me. They're also pieces that kind of show how he's figured, but also one of the rare articles that talk about how, or give voice to him. He was also often talked about, not really talk. He didn't really have a lot of room to talk. His texts are extraordinarily difficult for me at the time. Compositions, Crazy Nigger, Evil Nigger, Gay Gorilla. His music was often censored. So after the kind of a deep dive and an investigation in his archive, and again, archived loosely, both at Buffalo through the use of, and the gift of his brother's permission, talking to folks, as well as like, you know, going and seeing pieces of the music that's played where things have landed in terms of excerpts of jam sessions, et cetera, I decided to, create 2 exhibits that showed at the kitchen. First in Philadelphia in 2017. It was presented kind of as a retrospective project for him. Basically, I wanted to put 2 exhibits in the same room. One that's called A Recollection, one that's called Predicated. A Recollection dealt with a series of historical materials that I put in the mix and in confrontation with 14 artists that I've curated, who I basically went around and looked at the most difficult works that they had, or the works that maybe hide in the studio, and talked to them about Julius and bring them in conversation with him. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and it would be great if all the presenters could join me on stage. Okay, thank you so much for all of your great presentations. And I want to start it off by returning to some of the ideas that Shannon actually brought up, and relating it to all of it to the stakeholders, the archivists and the scholars. And of course, archivists are really important in creating these archives and maintaining them. They wouldn't be able to do that without the experts, whether you call them scholars or something else. And I think the issue that I guess all of you have run into is also that the expertise, that the language, that the subjects just did not exist, which also means that the frameworks created for them ultimately do not exist. And one thing that really struck me in all of your presentations was also how much they were about language, about you finding keywords, for example, about you dealing with all those texts and textual implications, and the books of the Hirschfeld archive. So this idea of creating frameworks and language for a foundation for an archive, I think, is really prominent in all of your work. And I think artistic practice or activist practice in creating these archives is a great opportunity to fill the gaps in the archives we have, whether that's missing and excluded subjects, whether that is the frameworks that we actually need to talk about relationships that are not normative. And one more thing I also want to bring in here is we use the word archive, and I think the associations of archive are very stuffy, ultimately. Here we go into, this library with dusty books, although libraries and archives are very different. But I think what we're dealing with today is so much more the notion of the database, or even big data and relations between these data entities. And I think this relational aspect is so important to queer archives, rather than having those singular categories. So much of creating those archives really resides in the relational. So my first question, or what I was wondering, in all your practices dealing with personal archives, institutional archives, or Shannon, you investigating archives, what to you is one of the driving forces, or perhaps there are many of them? Is it really giving voice to the excluded, finding a memory, creating language and frameworks, or, as you said, even exhibition displays that come closer to what needs to be communicated here? Anyone want to start?
Okay, I guess so.
Go for it.
I think I'm very much informed by my peers, or like interactions. I think there's been an immense frustration that was happening like a couple of years when I really started to think about what my relationship was to these particular archives that came at the coming into the art world, and people are very interested in being the first, or like claiming that they are the first. And me at my age at 38, I'm kind of in this in-between space. So having younger peers who are like, I'm the first Black queer, and I'm just like, what is going on here? But also like in their mind, yeah, maybe they are, right? In their positionalities. But I also knew that there was something that didn't survive this like transition over to this internet conversation. Because of, quite frankly, the limitations of like archivists and archives. I always, I was a library kid. So I always understood that limitation to be there growing up in South Carolina when I would go and look for Black texts because, libraries, archives become racialized based on the archivist who takes care of them, what those eyes are. They're still read and processed through a certain kind of hand. And so I think that those are the things that put me in the room, and then I just kind of follow whatever's speaking and what kind of like comes into conflict with what's going on right now.
Yeah, I think I relate to what you just said, but I think I also identify with this idea of shifting the terms of narration. And I think your read of the ways in which language has structured our relationship to these institutional compilings of material and information pertains to a very specific form of language, right? It is constructed in certain categories that have rarely been disputed. And they have been disputed critically in many fields, but not necessarily in a kind of counter relationship to the institutions of history and the social sciences. So I've been interested in kind of identifying that fault and thinking through the ways in which you can shift the narration. You can create a counter narrative around things that have been assimilated as historical, as as institutional, and as truth ultimately.
I think that mine is related to more associative practice and elements of serendipity. I guess that kind of like following, like you understand that you're kind of in a cloud, and you start to see how these things sort of line up and create these other kinds of images, and then you reshuffle that and you see what other kind of image you can make. I think with language and the Hirschfeld stuff, because so much language is absent, I'm really drawn to the stories of the rebuilding, the stories of the collecting that the archivists have told me, and that sort of recreates this sort of like phantom architecture of this space. And as I sort of mentioned earlier in my talk, that kind of like blind looking and not knowing when you will find what you find, and not knowing when it's over, that what you will find is its limit, has been really both parallel and encouraging in my own sort of queer archive building of the project of Anthropology at large. So I like not being alone in, like, with my eyes closed or in the dark or underground or wherever, and then finally bumping into something.
I think Dean's term architecture kind of gets at where a lot of my interests lie. That's where the conceptual, the vocabulary matches up with or doesn't match with the physical apparatus of the archive. And that can be everything from the box that something has to fit in, the shelf it has to fit on, the amount of storage space an institution has, and what has to determinations have to be made as to what can be saved or not, to the server, like what comes in a form that can actually be preserved for longevity. And this some of these limitations determine what is actually archivable knowledge. For example, performative things that are kind of organic forms, for instance. Other forms of knowledge production haven't readily lent themselves to preservation and classification within the physical infrastructures of archives in many cases. So it's not like the language, we don't have a label for it. Sometimes we don't have a metaphorical or a physical box for it also.
Yeah, so it's both the language and it's the architecture. What I also find very interesting about the Hirschfeld project is you're archiving the archive. You know, there's this meta layer of here was an archive, and then that archive vanished, and now you're dealing with archiving that archive, you know, and creating yet another framework. And I think that also resonates with some of the work you have done in historical institutionalized archives, you know, or forgotten. And then Tiona is very not different, but intersecting with it coming from a very personal end. And I'm also very interested in how you navigate that territory of either, I think in your case, it's really starting with a personal story, and creating that personal framework. In both of your cases, it's also dealing with existing archival materials and basically reshuffling the deck, or creating new frameworks or languages for that. So I was wondering what that process is like, or if you're aware of the differences between the two and in your engagement.
Mine is really, I think it's been a waiting for the voices that come out of it. And it just takes time as I continue to ask questions or talk, or we look at new material or a new story comes out. We just, I sit at the table long enough for something else to happen. So yeah, it is just like a waiting for that story. And then the longer I'm able to be there, the more they come up. But it doesn't come in any kind of organized time frame. It's really like the mood, or like the whatever's happening for Raymond or Rolf or whoever wants to tell me something that day. It's really based on where they're finding it in their elbow or their heel, or you know what I mean? It's like it's in their body, like that story, but like there's something about where they are in that day where they choose to tell me that.
Yeah, and once again, I find that very interesting, because we tend to see archives as these existing architectures and frameworks, but in all of your works, it becomes very obvious that it is about personal stories, and taking that personal story to a different level. I don't know if you...
Yeah, I mean, I think there is an aspect to the approach that I've had with these institutional archives that wants to engage with an institutional critique of the categories, the systems of categorization, the architectures for the arrangement of knowledge, etc. But I think ultimately my interest in this is to create personal stories and recover the loss of subjectivity and feeling and emotion and love and all of these things that oftentimes don't make it to the ways in which we conventionally think of the archives. And they really also come from a very personal place, my personal life. So I'm interested in, for example, with the cases that exist in the criminal files, in establishing a process of identification and an idea of recovering these tragic lives told in tragic terms through fiction, as a way of creating a relationship that may end up in a queer narration that has a happy ending, and in creating a fictional narration that will turn this character who was Martina, for example, her life ends as we know it today in the moment in which she is absolved from the crime that she has been charged with. And we don't know anything else about her. So with Maya Migdashi, my collaborator, we made it a point to turn her into a heroic figure of the pro-independence movement against the Spanish crown. So she went from being like this, marginal figure to becoming somebody who was trafficking in materials and information and made the revolution possible. So those things, I think, for important to be able to shift those terms to give these characters that have otherwise been subjected to this endless violence a different way for us to have a different way to relate to them.
I think all of you really changed notions of the archive and of the historical record by just creating language examples. I think that even the tiniest archive has an impact on that level. Maybe I'm naively optimistic, but I believe that everything is a contribution to that. But I'm also wondering how you think about preservation of and access to archives and the archives you're creating. This is, of course, if you maintain an institutional archive, that's what the whole operation is about. And you start with a lot of personal histories, so they shouldn't go down with you either, right? So, what is you're thinking about that aspect of access, preservation?
I think about it through citation. And I mean, like, I think one thing that I want to say is that, you know, in thinking about archive, like even within my practice, rather, Black Mental Fact puts me at the feet of people. So I'm really interested in, like, I can sit in, you know, get the finding aids, I can go and look at all the databases and all that stuff, but then I can go talk to someone and listen to what their truth is, and it kind of like, I put it at the same place, or I held it at the same value. And that's something that I'm very interested in, what comes out of that, like, proximity. But what happens is that usually that person isn't brought into the conversation based off of a citational kind of methodology. So, like, within my practice, I'm interested in that as a form of preservation. How do you bring people who, through their recollections, through their memory, whether fragile or not, become just as important as this document? Because we all, like, you know at this point, a lot of those things are false, right? Yeah. They're created, they're like fictional. And so I think it's, you know, for the work that I do, it's very important to always, like, kind of have that derailing aspect or this living aspect, because at the end of the day, I mean, most of the more valuable information has always come from an oral history. And so that training has been disrupted because of the way that we feel that we can always go get it. So when you can't always go get it, I think that there's something, you know, the body, having someone in front of you that kind of shows that fragility of what it looks like, whether it's through their body or the way that they talk, et cetera, is really important to remind people that it will always be in flux. So it doesn't matter if it, I think I am very interested in, like, the efforts of, you know, tagging, you know, creating tags and what that yields. I wish there were better systems where the, you know, quote unquote layman person outside can, you know, kind of interact and create tags within these systems in opposition to the archivist, because I do think that they see things differently. So those things, I think, together can create a new and more legible and a different kind of longevity conversation around the archive.
That's also precisely what I meant by this relational aspect, you know, what you're getting at with tagging, with forming new relationships. And then I think this idea of basically using the archive as as establishing a network of people and their stories that is spreading. That's also a very important aspect that takes us beyond those institutional frameworks.
Well, I'm still collecting stories, so you haven't quite. I'll talk to you about tagging,
Yeah.
and then technology will change and we'll do something else. But I guess I think about the books as a kind of also like a kind of like a platform or offering towards this way that these objects might live on or live in the future, or offer another place to speak from. I don't know if that's about archival or, like, it's not about archiving. It's about continuing that dialogue, continuing speech, continuing invitation, and collecting. Maybe that doesn't answer about how archival it will stay.
No, it does, I think, in the sense that what you're doing is also really broadening the language or terminology of the archive. Yeah, it's not the standard definition thereof, you know, but also taking it out of the architecture that Shannon talked about, you know, and creating new, more dynamic relationships, which is what I think we need for all of these missing data sets. And particularly in this day and age, and in the age of AI and big data mining, you know, missing data sets have such an impact, you know, in terms of really leading to whole social frameworks that do not care, that do not pay attention, you know, to the certain parts of history of living, you know, and it's, I think, very important to broaden that dialogue.
Yeah, I mean, in my case, I think that the relational aspect that you mentioned is very important. One of the things that I've set out to do, even though it's a really hard job and it sometimes escapes my agency as an artist, is make sure that, for example, the project towards homoerotic historiography, I really wanted that work to exist within the collection of an institution that houses the original objects, because I thought of it really as a kind of relational, confrontational experience between the mini archive or presentation that I created and the objects, because the narration about those objects is really never going to change in a museum like that. So part of the initial concept was really always looking at the ways in which that could enter and disturb the reading of those objects by the relationship. And with this work, I was lucky enough that the Metropolitan acquired it. So right now it's going to be always in conversation with those objects and hopefully creating a different way of relating to those displays and presentations that will become the way that they have been.
Yeah, would be nice if they would be presented next to each other, you know, in a
that's a plan.
In a completely different way. Yeah.
I think there's also some interesting work that's happening with Indigenous archives that connects these ideas of relationality and preservation and access. So, for example, there's work with Indigenous databases that attempt to recreate the social infrastructure or social relations into the access policies for the digitized records. So you can build essentially into the access policies who is or is not permitted to access a particular record. So it could be that certain things are supposed to be seen only by elders or only by women, or only during certain seasons of the year, for instance. So realizing that not universal access is not a universal right, essentially, recognizing that certain things are not meant to be preserved or are not meant for everyone to be seen.
Yeah. Before we open it to the audience, I had one more question about the fact that queering and decolonizing the archive almost has become, you know, a trend, you know, and fashionable term, which is yet another issue of language that can become problematic in terms of the specificity of your efforts. And you talked a little bit about the history of the term itself, you know, what that meant. So how is that going to change the landscape, or are you already noticing that in terms of the language and how it is changing around your particular work or efforts?
No. As I think that, I mean, let me see how I can say that. I'm not, you know, I don't believe in collective ideas of decolonization more as much as I believe in individual responsibility around what that means. In this country, I don't know if it will happen because there is value and commodity that's put on the academy. So unless the academy is completely deconstructed, or the people who, you know, we actually engage with, scholars, are kind of like, again, put at the same level of folks who don't have these degrees in this kind of a way around the value of knowledge, I don't think that that will actually come to exist in a real way. Mm-hmm. I think that it's like just like a I don't know. It's like it's so frustrating because it's like everything that's around my work. So the efforts of it could be, quite frankly, rather easy if people give up that power, but they're not going to, right?
Yeah.
And I think, like, you know, when it comes to, you know, what I've been focusing on, African diasporic objects, African objects, you know, there's a lot of conversation around repatriation, you know, and I think that, you know, I've said it in interviews, I've said it before, it's like it's a reparative knowledge kind of like formation that has to occur where, again, the people who create the objects, the people that the scholars do not respect, are actually given the stronghold and a determination, or able to determine the value and the placement of these objects or these things. So, yeah, as it stands in, like, it makes me almost even uncomfortable to talk about it at Parsons or New School. I don't know where I'm at, but yeah, because it's like, yeah, it's like, it's a cool idea, but I'm like, come on. It's like, even, you know, the fact that of the educational system and like how it's structured, curatorial practice and how it's structured, it's just a really bizarre thing for me. So I think that there should be a challenge. I mean, I challenge everybody that individually, what are the little efforts that you could do to kind of like remove yourself from that, and then that becomes inherently a collective action that has more weight than the idea of coming together and trying to invoke ideas of fear or momentary decolonization, you know, protest and stuff like that. So,
yeah. Can I answer?
Yeah.
Yeah. So this past weekend, I convened a symposium at UC Santa Cruz and SF MoMA on questions of bodies at the borders, and two of the people that were invited to speak were Joseph Pierce and Dimian Dinayasi, who are both, one is an artist and the other one is an Cherokee Nation scholar. And they tackled head-on this question of land acknowledgement and what it meant for them as members of indigenous tribes, living in the present with the realities of what it means to be an indigenous person today in the United States. And it was really interesting to hear them speak about how they oftentimes perceive this as an empty gesture, right? A kind of acknowledgement that becomes co-opted again by an institution. And they were much more radical. They were saying, like, what we need actually is give us the space, not for an exhibition. Don't include me in your show. Give me the whole museum so that I can put a teepee or, you know, a sweat lodge or do whatever the fuck I want. Yeah. So that on the one hand. The other one is, I think at this point we've become very much accustomed to understanding how academia and institutions co-opt radical gestures, right? So, and to me, this question of the trendiness of the term decoloniality, decolonization, etc., and the kind of ignorance around where it stems from, the context that gave birth to it. So if you ask most of these people who are decolonial artists today who Silvia Kusikanki is, they have no idea, right? So the question is, like, how do you make sure that you engage with the term with the responsibilities that it entails, right? And that you don't think that you can now apply it at the Parsons New School or at the New Museum or at the Whitney, whatever, and they become just empty gestures that fit grant applications and forms of inclusion, but are not really changing the status quo and the ways that we relate to that.
Yeah, that was precisely, you know, the impetus for my question, and how you resist that and how you can change those structures, because I think it's increasingly happening. On that note, perhaps we'll open it up to the audience, so you also have some time for questions.
This isn't so much a question, but I'm an independent archivist, and I work a lot with artists that are sort of on the margin or not really explored as deeply as they should be, or not unknown, and I felt they should be sort of revived, resuscitated, or brought to the attention. But one thing I'm really interested in doing within archives is when someone is working and developing an archive, there's all kinds of things that you discover and that happen and that you realize, depending on what you're bringing to the archive. And I think there are two things that I try to do, which is have the person who's working on the archive create some kind of a narrative that's a reflection on them, because they have certain of what they've come to realize, discover, or find is missing or is lost, or what they expected to find or not find, as part of a narrative that becomes part of the archive, to kind of illuminate it in a kind of way so that people can begin to think about things maybe they hadn't thought about, as well as creating some kind of database of all the personal relationships, kind of a mapping of the people around that person, so that when they're studying this one person, they're not focusing on that, but focusing through a network and a mapping of other people, you know, the janitor, the mother, the nurse that took care of them, the blah, 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 blah. Because I think it's like all important. And I don't know why there aren't archives to do more of that. You sort of have to dig through them to find out who the people are, but there's never any kind of a map, and there's never any kind of narrative about what the archivists are actually finding or discovering as they're going through it, to maybe open people's ideas about what they're looking for.
I think it's a really good point, because, you know, in all of your practices, what becomes very clear is, once again, here you're waiting for someone telling you a story. You know, there's something deeply personal, and it's the people and it's the connection between the people that make the archive happen, while it looks so objective in the end. You know,
I mean, to kind of answer that, well, most people who are have, like, you know, not everyone donates their archive while they're living. So the reason narrative exists is because some people, like, kind of have to find it, and so there's nobody that actually, you know, engage and talk to them. There's also, like, you know, I just want to kind of disrupt the idea of, like, these kind of, like, you know, archives, or I think I would want to throw in maybe, you know, just out there, just for the sake of like my conscious archives that need to kind of remain fugitive in a way. You know, and this is like a real thing, just because I'm like kind of working with a range of like, you know, Black BDSM archives. And if you think about the way of like, you know, material culture archive matter, there are things that are inherently have a certain kind of like subjective read within the community. How do those things still have a certain kind of accessibility to those folks, but then have a certain kind of accessibility to others, or things that never need to enter into an archival space and need to exist in this kind of ephemeral place? I'm thinking about those. Those are just things that I'm, you know, throwing out there, just complicate the idea of this like cohesive kind of formative finding aid archive. I think the archivists read, they do produce text. That's the finding aid. When you go into archive and they give you that finding aid, that's someone who has gone through that archive and created it, and it's not in a narrative kind of form, aside from the bio. It's because they don't want to affect what you are looking for. So there's a reason, I understand on the other side, why those things don't exist. So just wanted to throw those kind of notes out to complicate.
This is also more of a comment, but something that was interesting, I think, in what y'all were talking about was there was kind of an embodied aspect to having spent time in archives, whether it's someone telling you something from your ankle or oral history, and even now with fugitivity. And so I'm wondering if y'all could speak more about maybe embodied knowledge or anything that brings to mind.
Briefly, I can talk about the piece that I'm doing with Eva Sievert, which is translating her text, and I don't speak German, but it is a matter of like holding someone else's words in your mouth and speaking them back and forth and allowing an impression of someone else's words in your body. That's how I've been thinking about sort of like ingesting but holding but not ingesting. I don't know, that kind of like speaking the thing that someone else spoke or someone else wrote, and just kind of holding it there.
I mean, with Brad, right? Like there was like a thing that I read that piece on subjugation. I had a physical reaction, right? It's like lightheadedness. I almost wanted to, like, could hear my heart beat in my ears, you know? And so the process that I put myself, like the body, like the engagement that I did of reading these texts and kind of aligning them with these different SM acts, was to see if I can like match the feeling from the read to what I was doing physically to myself. So it was like kind of the splitting of self is very much edge, you know? It's kind of like, you know, also thinking about when he was writing, there was a huge amount of poets who were thinking about, you know, body as poem, poem as body, that kind of engagement, and what it would mean to document myself. So twofold, reading, putting myself in this act to see if I can feel the same thing while reading, pleasure, right? Then watching the document. The document hasn't been shown. Most of it that people have seen is the beginning one that's been published of his, The Hitter, where I'm beat with like 24 Roses by a dominatrix while reading a text. And the last one where I suspend myself from my feet. The others haven't been shown because the work hasn't been published. So it's like this kind of like, you know, thing that's mine, you know. And then that work, like if anybody's like familiar with the show that I just had last year for Company, that's the result of that work. So that work becomes a document in my body. It was me dealing with like, I'm scared of abstraction. I don't know how to deal with it. So like going and putting that information, figuring out how I can process it, hold it. How did it feel in the back of my jaw? You know what I mean? How does this leather need to look? How does it need to shine? If I think about just the fantasy of this man walking, you know, in the club at night, the glimmer on his boots, how does it need to shine? So that's like how I like kind of like, you know, process it and put it back out in a different form so it could be read in a different way.
Yeah, to that question of the embodiment, I always think of the really incredible work that Julie Tolentino has been doing in archiving endurance performance work by other artists in her own body, right? And kind of like from the acknowledgement that these practices have not been collected institutionally, but also from the acknowledgement that they are, in a way, fugitive practices that responded to a specific moment in time and were meant for specific communities that she is a part of, right? And so what it means to like carry these things from your own body, and hopefully at some point somebody else will embody them again, right? And so I think that that idea of passing on knowledge through oral history or embodiment or interpretation or things like that is really important, and I think it's at the ethos of a queer practice that I want to subscribe to and kind of reproduce if I can.
I think you also see represented the challenges of it in the paucity or the insufficiency of a lot of performance archives, the attempt to try to transform the embodied into a video recording or a dance notation, for instance. Just how insufficient those more stable records are at actually capturing the embodied really reminds you of how the physical thing, the shine on the shoe, all of this stuff, just some of it can't be captured in traditional archival forms.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for your presentations. I was impressed how polite you guys were with the archive. I was kind of expecting you to mess with it much more. Because, of course, the archive is absurd, because it's in itself an institution. Where it becomes interesting is when we engage in it as individuals through our own perspective and agency. I mean, Saidiya Hartman gave us such a beautiful gift with her book and language to think that through. I think to think outside, not even outside or against, but like think with the archive in itself as absurd. Because I agree, Tiona, I'm glad you brought that up, this notion of the fugitive, or that certain archives are not considered to be archived, or certain collection of things or accumulations of knowledges that cross maybe from a body through a text to an image or something, that they are not meant to be seen. And I think that's a really radical consideration that I learned from my indigenous colleagues, for sure, is that there's so much knowledge that it's not about for me, it's not so much about adding it to the archive, but to also just be at peace with the fact that certain things are not supposed to be known or seen or collected, but that doesn't mean they don't exist. And I think that is this thing that I would love you guys to, if you have some closing thoughts on this, but there's this idea of that the archive is somehow connected to existence. And I think our job as artists is to really mess with that notion.
Yeah, so in the film, I didn't show the film, but in the stills I presented from this film called The Sales, we encountered a really interesting thing. The complete story in the film is a conversation by letter, epistolary conversation between Martina, a fictionalized Martina who lives in the archive, and then Nur, who is a woman who lived a same-sex relationship, a lesbian in the Ottoman Empire. And we thought that this life would exist in an archive in the same ways in which it was archived by the Spanish or Portuguese crown in very methodical ways. And what we encountered is that relationships between women did not make it to those archives. They were dealt primarily in family law, right? They were dealt with at home, which meant that institutionally there is an absence that would render them invisible and hence potentially inexistent. But Maya, my collaborator, was really insisting, and we understood very well that the fact that they did not exist in the archive did not mean they didn't exist, right? So the idea of engaging with the projection of that life that happened and giving a voice to that absence, institutional archive absence, was essential to the film, and it constituted the form of the script. I don't know how we were polite with the archive, Andrea, in the sense that I think I don't know your work so well, but we're not like setting the archive on fire or like staging a protest within it. But I think we all seem to be resisting the institutional constraints and its claims to validity, institutionality, truth-making, knowledge reproduction, etc. And I think that is a form of resistance that is important as well.
I would also add to that it's problematic to say the archive, and it's an otherness that's institutionalized. I mean, everybody on stage here is creating archives, and to me there are very different archives. They're not the archive you're talking about, you know, as this institutionalized, rigid frameworks. It's about changing the language itself, and we're all part of it and have a personal relationship to it. I think that's also important to keep in mind. Any other questions, or maybe we end it on that note? Thank you very much.
Thank you.